Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we'll learn about data fetching fundamentals with Next.js, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. Next.js just released 13.2, and as I discussed in the previous lesson, the metadata was changing, and we see this now with built-in SEO support, so we'll quickly cover those changes, and then we'll get started with data fetching fundamentals. We're back in the beta docs for Next.js, and we're going to go ahead and create a new app. We don't have anything from the previous lessons 1 or 2 that we really need to carry over to number 3, so we'll just create a new one because there's some changes with Next 13.2. And I've had a couple of comments with people asking why I'm teaching experimental features moving forward. Well, Next.js is using 13 going forward, and they are constantly incrementing these features and adding some new things. So I'll try to cover those if they continue during this series. However, I'd rather teach the new features than the previous ones because this is the direction that Next.js is headed. So with that noted, let's go ahead and just copy this automatic installation here, this npx command that we're going to use in the terminal, and then let's go over to Visual Studio Code. Okay, I'm in Visual Studio Code, and I'm in my parent folder. You can see it's for the Next series folder that I created, and I've got lessons 1 and 2 here, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new app and call it Next.03. You can call it whatever you want. I'm going to open the terminal first, and then with this terminal opened, I'll just clear out whatever was in here before. I'm going to paste in what we just copied, and that's npx create next app at latest, and then it has the -- experimental app flag, so we can add that new app folder, and that's the direction that Next.js is headed. So I'll press enter. It's going to ask me some questions. I'll go ahead and expand this up. So okay to proceed. Yes, I want to, and we're on 13.2.3 right now, and 13.2 was just released 1 week ago, so you can see they're constantly incrementing these features. What's this project called? Well, I'm going to call it not lesson 03, but Next 03 to just add to my series. Then we're going to go with the default selections here. So TypeScript, yes. ESLint, yes. Source directory, no, because we're using the new app directory. And then the import alias, yes, just the default there. It will quickly create this project, and then we can see a few of the changes once we go into the Next 03 folder, because I won't leave this full file tree over here. I'll go ahead and open up this folder. All right, I'm in my Next 03 folder, and if we look over here to the left in the file tree, the individual files that we see, there's 8 of those, and those are the same as before when we started a project. However, you'll notice there are fewer folders. There's no longer a pages directory at all. Everything is now in the app directory, including that API folder that was in the pages directory, and I've had several people ask questions about the API folder. Right now it has a hello folder and the new route.ts file. We may eventually get to that, but of course that's about an API, and right now we're building pages and a website with Next.js, and that falls under the app directory, but it follows the page and layout model that we covered in the previous lesson. What I really want to highlight is what I said was changing in lesson 2, and that is the metadata, and I showed how they were going to do it, and now you see it is already added to the layout file in the top app directory here. We have metadata right here. Now this is static metadata, and we'll learn how to add dynamic metadata later as well. Right now though, we're using TypeScript, and if we mouse over this, I can see, well, I should be able to see what type we have. There we go. And you can see it's an object with the title and description string, and that's all it is. You could let TypeScript infer that, or now you can go ahead and import the metadata type. So I'm going to show you how to do that with import type, and then we can say metadata, and this is going to come from Next, and after that you can actually use the metadata type right here if you want to. So there's metadata, and now if I mouse over this, we should be able to see just a little bit more information. It's the interface metadata type. You could actually click and look at the definition of that as well, but it's going to give all of the different possibilities that you could put in your metadata object. So again, just to note, this replaces the head components that we were adding, like head.tsx. That no longer exists over here, and there's no reason to create it. It's no longer supported. That is deprecated, and we're now using an export of metadata to create the metadata for a full layout. This would add this to the full branch and all child branches, or you can add this statically to any page that you want to statically create that with. And once again, I will go over how to generate the dynamic metadata if we're generating pages dynamically. Now, before we start with data fetching, there's just a little bit of setup I want to do. So one of the things I want to do is pull the font that the page actually has here, and I'm going to just copy these 3 lines, I guess 4 lines, 2 through 5 right here. I'm going to just Control C, go back to the layout, and now here at the top, I'm going to paste those in. I'm going to remove the styles one. I just really needed the font ones because this is pulling a Google font in, and I haven't really covered how to do that yet, but this is exactly what it's doing. It's pulling in this enter font from Google, and then we need this next line with the subset as well. And then back here in the page TS, we can see how they apply that also. I may need to quickly Control F just to search for the word enter, and here you can see it applied to the H2. It has class name, and then it's enter.classname. And I'm going to pull that over, Control C that line as well, or just that piece of it, and go back to the layout, and I'm going to apply that to the body, just because I want to use that font on everything for now. And now I want to go back to the root page, and as nice as their default root page looks, I want to go ahead and remove just about everything for now and make it very simple for us to work with today. So selecting everything between the main elements, and I'm just going to put in a couple of extra things here. So an H1 that says home page, so we know when we're back at the home page for sure. And then a paragraph, and inside the paragraph, I'm going to use a link. So we need to import link, and we're not using image anymore. So up here we can import link, and we did this in a previous lesson as well. And this link is going to come from next/link. And then here we can use that link, put link, put the href equal to, and we're going to create a users branch. So we'll go ahead and indicate that, and I'll just put users here. Of course, it's not going to work right now. We'll need to create that branch. And finally, while we're not focused on CSS today, I'm just going to go into the global CSS and scroll down here where they have the body area, and I'm just going to add some padding to the body overall. So it will move everything away from the edge just by 1 rem, and that's good. Now our initial setup is complete, and we're ready to move on to data fetching fundamentals. We're now back in the Next.js docs, and we're at data fetching fundamentals. And there are 4 recommendations that I want to go over because we're going to come back and refer to these as we write our code. So the first recommendation is to fetch the data on the server using server components. That's a big part of the power of Next.js. We're going to create these things in advance rather than on the client. So we're going to use server components. The second thing is to fetch data in parallel that minimizes waterfalls. And waterfalls would be fetching one type of data, waiting for that, and then fetching the next type of data, waiting for that, and then doing something else. So step by step, where in parallel, you can fetch the data that you need at the same time, so one isn't waiting on the other. Of course, this reduces loading times. Recommendation 3 for layouts and pages, fetch data where it's used. So you may see the same fetch request more than once, and that's okay because Next.js will automatically dedupe. That means deduplicate those requests in a tree. So it's going to just request it once, even though you might see that request in there more than once. So if it's already requested it, it's going to use that information that it has. It's not going to send duplicate requests. And recommendation 4 is to use the loading UI, which remember we went over the loading.tsx pages you could create to indicate loading for a specific branch or even a leaf, which would be an individual page, if you put a loading page in that area. However, there's also streaming and suspense. And if you know what React Suspense is, that means we can break apart a page, load part of the page, and then add suspense while the rest of the page loads. So that also improves the experience, and it progressively renders a page to show the result to the user while the rest of the content loads. So these 4 things we want to keep in mind as we create our code with data fetching. Okay, we're back in Visual Studio Code, and we're ready to create our users branch. So I'm just going to create a new folder here in the app directory, and I'm going to call this users. Now inside of the users directory, I need to create a page.tsx. Now the first thing I'm going to do here is import the type that we saw before, and that is metadata, because I'm going to use it as we add the metadata for this page. It will just be static metadata like we've already covered. So we'll start with our export const, then I'll say metadata, and the type is metadata. Then let's set this equal to an object, and I'm just going to set the title here, and it's going to be users. Now below this, I'm going to use my ES7 snippets extension and just type RFC to quickly create a functional component. Let's rename this component. Even though it is page.tsx, we don't have to name the function that. I should say that the file is named page.tsx, but the functional component inside the file does not have to have that name. So I'm going to call this users page. And now the first thing I'm going to want to do inside this component is actually request the users. And so to do that, I'm going to need to create a library function. I don't want to keep that just in here. Like I've seen others, of course, just define a function inside of the same file. You can do that. However, I want to organize my code and possibly be able to reuse that same function again and again without typing it again and again. So I'm going to create a library outside of the app directory. So just in the top parent directory, I'll create a new folder and I'll call it lib. And then inside of this, we can create our function that we export. So a new file here, and I'm going to call this getAllUsers.tsx. I'll once again start with RFC and just press tab. Now we have export default function, but this is also going to be an async function. So I want to add that word at the top as well. And now we're going to fetch some data from a website called JSON Placeholder. I've used that in several other tutorials, and so some of you may be familiar with that. But let's go ahead and create the fetch here. So I'll start off with const, I'll just say response equals await and fetch. And now really, it would be handy if I could just paste this URL in. So I think we should go to the website and I will just get the URL from the browser. We're here at the JSON Placeholder website, and you can see in the URL bar, it's jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. And from there, it offers resources. I'm just going to click on this /users link, and it provides 10 users. And here we'll see the data that comes up. This is just JSON data. I'm just going to copy this URL out of here to use back in our code. Now we're also going to come back here and grab one of these objects to create a type for this data as well. But first, let's just go back to our function and create that. All right, I'm going to paste in that URL into our fetch, and I'm going to press Alt-Z so it wraps any code that would extend down to the next line. Now after that, we just need to check to see if we got a good response or not, if we received a good response. So I'll say if, and then res is not okay, so res.ok, but it's got the exclamation in front of it, which means not. And we're going to throw a new error, and I'll just say failed to fetch data. That works. And then after that, we're not returning a div with getAllUsers. We're actually going to return the response.json right there. Let's bring this down and line it up. Well, see if it lines up after I save. There we go. So that's our basic function for getAllUsers. Worth noting that I did not put a try catch in here because we're going to use error boundaries if we were creating a project, and of course that would catch the error and we would get that response from the error boundary, which gives a component allowing the user to try again, and we covered that in the previous lesson as well. Let's go back to our page in the users branch, and now we're going to import that function. So we will import getAllUsers from our library, and you can see how it uses that now. It has the @lib/getAllUsers. And now once we've imported that, we can actually get that request going. This is our server component, so it's going to request this as it builds the website. So it will not be requesting it as a request. This will be a static page. It requests this during the build. And so we're going to say const users data. And now this would be a promise, and we need to put the type in there, and we don't have the type yet. So we'll need to create that. And then it will be getAllUsers. So we should grab that type. I'm back at our data here on the JSON placeholder website, and I'm just going to grab one of the user's objects here in the JSON data, and we're going to create our type from that. So I'm just copying all of that, and then we're going to come back to Visual Studio Code. Okay, we're back in VS Code, and notice this next-env.d.ts. Well, this is a type definition file right here. So we can create a file like this. So I'll just highlight this for a moment, and we're not going to create anything like you see inside this file, but we're going to name it with this same pattern, because if we look at our TypeScript config file, it wants to include this file that I just highlighted, but also any other file that starts out with this pattern. And so we're going to use that same type of pattern so TypeScript picks up on the file. So I'll create a new file here. I'll just call it types.d.ts. And you can see I'm using VS Code icons. It gets the TS icon over here. We can put in definitions. So to define our type user, I'm going to say type user, then set this equal to an object, but I've got this object to paste in. Now, of course, I'm not going to use these literal values here. I'm going to change these based on the data type, but I won't have you wait around and watch me do that. Okay, I've converted everything over now, so you can see most everything's a string here, and we start with an ID that's a number. So I'm just going to save this type. Now, TypeScript will pick up on this. We don't need the word export here or anything else, but we'll be able to pull this into our file. So this promise is going to return a user type, and then it's going to be an array of users actually. And so now we've added our type there, but we're not quite finished, because what happens is we start requesting that data right away. But notice I'm not using the await keyword. And then we'll have const users equals await users data. And of course, for await to work, we need to add the keyword async above here for our component as well. And now let's finish out our page, but one thing we need to do is import link once again. So I'm going to say import link, and that comes from next/link. Now that we have that, I'll go ahead and finish out the page. I'm going to define some content right here and map over what we expect to receive. So I have const content, set this equal to, I'll use parentheses. I'm going to start with a section element, so we have a parent element for the entire thing. Now let's put an H2 here, and inside the H2, I'm going to use that link, and the link is going to link back to home, essentially, back to our home page. And inside of that, I'll just put back to home. So that's at the top, and now we need to map over our data. Let me put one line break in there as well, so our header is separated just a little bit, because I'm not really using any extra CSS here today. Now inside of this, we're going to map over the users, and with that map, I'll say for each user, and inside of this, we're going to return, because we're down to the next line, and I've started a new block scope, so we need to use the return statement there. And then inside of that, I'll once again use parentheses. I'll create a fragment here. And inside the fragment, I'll say paragraph. This paragraph is going to need our key, though, as we map over. And let's give that the user.id. And then inside of the paragraph, we'll once again create a link. And inside the link, we need to link this to our users. So these will be dynamic pages. This href is going to receive some value here. Let's see what we get. We'll have a template literal, and it will go to users / and now I'm going to provide user.id. And then inside of the link itself, what we're linking to, let's link to the user.name, which would make more sense than somebody looking at the ID. I'm going to press Alt-Z again so that wraps down. And then after the paragraph, I'm going to go ahead and add one more line break just to separate those, so I'm not getting back into any CSS for now. And then at the very end here, instead of returning this div with a page, we're just going to return the content we defined above. And so now our users page component should be complete. And I almost forgot one other thing I want to add just to demonstrate how this is working with a server component is I'm going to add a console.log statement here and just say hello so we can see where this appears as well. With this much complete, let's go ahead and open a terminal window. We can type npm run dev just to begin running the program in dev mode. And you can see that we are now at localhost 3000, and I can just control click on this link and it should launch the web page in the browser. Might take a second to get going. Yep, we see the home page, and the link to the users is way down here because we still have some of those styles applied. But if I pull this over to the right, maybe I can close the terminal or a few things here in VS Code and I could see both at the same time. I think if we go to the layout, I believe, no, maybe it's the page here itself, and I'll go ahead and hide the file tree. I could just remove this main class name styles.main part here of the main element and save, and now it should remove that. And so now our home page title and our users link is right here at the top. Let me go ahead and bring this over to the full screen, but then I want to go ahead and open up DevTools, and notice we're at the Network tab in DevTools. I'll clear this out. Let me reload everything, and we're in dev mode, so it's going to load several things. I wonder if I could make this any taller, but it doesn't look like it. But it loads quite a few things here in dev mode because that will be different than you would see with a build. All right, let's clear this out. And now when I mouse over the user's link, you see requests happen immediately. So it goes ahead and starts prefetching that before we've even clicked on it. I haven't clicked on it yet. Okay, once I do, we should get our data. And yes, we see all the users' names. And notice, as I moused over, I did the first three, it tried to request those pages. Now we haven't actually built the pages yet, so we're getting errors for now. But if I mouse over another one, for example, there we see it for number 6 as well. So it tries to get that data in advance. And of course, we can go ahead and handle these errors and anything that would occur that way, but what we should do is just go ahead and create those dynamic pages. We're back in VS Code, and now we're going to create a dynamic route. That's something we did not previously do when we learned about pages and layouts. So let's do that now. It's going to be inside of the users branch. Now let's create a new directory, and we'll put this in brackets. And now we need to name this whatever we're going to name the parameter, the prop that we are passing to our component that is dynamically generated. So I'm going to name this user ID because that is what we'll be getting from the param in the URL. So now I'll press enter, and we have that. Inside of this, let's create a page.tsx. And inside of the page.tsx, we're going to create a functional component here. So RFC with my ES7 snippets. And we'll go ahead and rename this as well. And this is going to be for individual users. So I'll name this user page. So above our functional component, I'm going to need to create a type for the params that we're going to receive. So I'll just say type params. I'm going to set this equal to an object that has params. And then inside of that, it's going to have the user ID, which your parameters from your URL are always strings. So that will be a string here. Now we can specify that inside of our functional component. So we start off with params, and then inside of that, we're going to receive the user ID. And now we need to provide the type. So we come out here outside of both of those curly brackets, and we'll provide params there. So this component is going to fetch data in parallel like the recommendations that we previously went over. Let's quickly go back and look at those docs. Now we started our first users component by fetching data on the server, and that's what we want to do. And this next component is also a server component, and we're going to need more data from 2 different API endpoints. And so we're going to fetch data in parallel and not create a waterfall. So now back in VS Code, we need to go ahead and create a couple more functions inside of our lib directory here, our library. So let's start, I'll just highlight the first one, then create a new file, and we'll just call this get user. Instead of getting all users, we're just going to fetch the data for one user. And once again, I'll start with RFC and press tab, and then I need to add the async keyword here for our function. After that, let's go ahead and put in our request. So it's going to be const res once again, set this equal to await fetch, and we'll need to get the URL from JSON placeholder again. Let's go ahead and finish out the rest first. So I'll say once again, if res is not okay, then we're going to throw a new error. And now we can just say something like failed to fetch user. And then after that, we need to return the JSON once again. So we'll say return res.json. And we'll add an extra line there and save. That's our basic function. So now let's just put in the URL to get the specific user we need. Okay, back at the JSON placeholder website, we can see the resources here, and the /users gave us all 10 users. But if we go down and look at routes, you can see the example they give. If you just put posts 1, which would be the ID afterwards, you would just get the post with the ID of 1. So we could do the same with users, and we could just put an ID after it for 1, for example, and that should give us the user. So let's try this out inside our browser, and yes, that gives us just the user. So we can just replace that 1 with dynamic data in the URL. Back in Visual Studio Code, we now know this needs to be a template literal, so I'll remove those single quotes and put in backticks instead. Paste in the URL that we just received, Alt-Z to wrap that down, and we can see the number 1 here. That's what we want to replace with a template literal. So here, we're going to provide the user ID, and that means our function needs to receive the user ID above. We already determined that's going to be a string type. And now we also need to create get user posts. So we need all the posts from an individual user. I'm just going to copy everything in this file, Control A to highlight all, Control C to copy. Now I'm going to create this new file over here and call this one get user posts.tsx. Inside of this file, I'll paste in what I just copied, but we'll change the name here to get user posts. It's once again going to receive the user ID, Alt-Z to wrap everything down. Now it is going to have a different URL, but without going back to look at JSON placeholder again, I can just tell you what the URL will be. Instead of users here, it's going to be posts. So we're looking at the posts, and then we need to pass the param that says what the user ID is. And you can do that with a question mark, and then we're going to have user ID equals, and then we'll of course have our user ID value. And with that created, you now know we need to get the post type as well. Once again, I'll do it the same way that I did before for the user. Go to JSON placeholder, copy one of the posts, and then of course turn that object into a type. Without having you watch that full process, I'll just scroll down here to the types.d.ts, and I can paste in the type that I have previously created, but you know how I did it the same way as I did with the previous one. So we just have a post here with a user ID that is a number, which will come into play, an ID that's a number, and then the title and body that are strings. Let's go back to our page that we are creating here, the individual user ID page that is being created, and we need to fetch this data in parallel now that we have created those functions. So at the top, we should import both of those functions. So we will need get user, and we also need to import get user posts. Now that we have those, let's request that data in parallel as recommended by Next.js. We'll start by defining the user data, and this will be a promise, and we're just receiving an individual user back. Notice we're not going to use the await keyword here. We'll just say get user, so it starts the request right away, and we'll have an ID. However, we do need to make this an async function as well, because we will eventually await something. After that, we need to go ahead and create our user's posts data as well. So let's say user, our user, just individual user, posts, plural, data. There we go. And this will be a promise, and it's going to receive back an array of posts. So that is our type, and we'll set this equal to get user posts, and of course we need to pass in the user ID here as well. And I notice this extending off the screen, so I'm going to press Alt-Z just to bring this down. Now our emphasis here is that we are requesting this data in parallel. Notice we're not using the await keyword on either one of these requests. We just say start both of these requests. But then after that, one way to do this is to use promise.all. So then we could say const, and we would be receiving a user, and we would be receiving posts or user posts. We could name it that, to be clear. And then we could await, and we would say promise.all. And then inside of this, we first have parentheses, then we have our user data and our user posts data. And we could let this then resolve in parallel. and we are waiting until we have the data from both, but we start the requests at the same time. We're not creating a waterfall where we wait on one after the other. So then we can complete the component here with the return statement, and I'll just change what we currently have there. Instead, I'll use parentheses and then a fragment, and inside the fragment, I'm going to first have an H2, and inside the H2, we could use the user name, and then after that, we would say have a different component that we haven't created yet. Let me create another line break here, but then let's go ahead and put in a component called user posts. Again, has not been created yet, so we won't like what we see here with a red squiggly, but we'll eventually create the component. And we'll set the posts equal to the user posts that we got back. Then after that, we would just go ahead and give the slash, because this would retrieve all the posts for that specific user. Now this approach does work, especially after we create the component we need, and it is documented in the docs. However, their recommendation number 4 actually gives us something that will improve this approach. If we look at recommendation number 4 back here in Data Fetching Fundamentals, it says we can use loading UI, streaming, and suspense to progressively render a page, and we could incrementally show results to the user while the rest of the content loads. So let's do that with our component. So the approach we will take here is to load the user, and we'll show the username, but then we could use suspense. We could wrap our user posts in suspense so we could actually show the username while we're still waiting on the posts. And to do that, I need to import suspense at the top. So we'll import suspense from React. And now we can use that in our component, and we'll also be changing our promise all approach. But first, let's just apply suspense down here inside of the component. And so inside of the component now, after our break, I'm just going to put in suspense, and then we'll go ahead and of course take the closing suspense and put it after the user post component. And then inside of suspense, we need a fallback, and I'll just provide a simple one here. Fallback equals, and here I'm going to put another H2, and I'll just say loading. So that's our simple fallback for the suspense. But now inside of users posts, we're going to change what we're sending here, and we're going to change our approach above. So instead of this promise all, which I'll just comment out to leave inside of the resources for the lesson in case you want to refer back to that, because it is a valid approach that's documented, but so is the one that I'm about to use that follows the recommendation number 4. And this will be getting our user. Here we'll just await user data, but now we still have a promise for the user post data, and that's what we're going to pass down. So let's switch this to promise, and here this would be the user post data that we're sending down into the user post component. So let's go ahead and create our user post component, and to do that I'm going to create a components directory here inside of our route. We'll put components, and then inside of this components directory we'll go ahead and create a component as we would normally name it. I'm just going to name it user post.tsx. Now this components route is not available to the public because it doesn't have a page.tsx inside of this directory, and that's the way we want to leave this. Now here I'm going to start by typing props again, so I'll have type, and I'll have props, and I'm going to set this equal to promise that is being sent down, and it is a promise that is a post, well, it's an array of posts. There we go. And then after we have our type here, let's go ahead and create our function, RFC. And now this is going to be an async function as well, because we need to await our promise that we're receiving. And so then inside of our props here, we'll see that we have a promise, and the type is just going to be the props we created before. Okay, now that we're receiving that promise, let's go ahead and get our post first thing. So we'll say const posts. This is going to equal await that promise that we receive. Then let's define some content. So I'll say content, set this equal to posts.map, map over each post. And then inside of our map function, we will return. Now I'm going to create an article, and this article is going to have a key, and that needs to be the post ID as we map over. Then after that, inside of the article, we can just use what we want from the post. So I'll create another H2 here. We'll make a post. Whoops, I need this inside of curly braces. Post.title. After the H2, I'm going to create a paragraph for the post body. And then let me put one more line break in because we're not really styling anything too nicely today. This will just add a little separation. And then finally, at the bottom of the component here, instead of the return div, once again, we're just going to return that content that I created. So that is our full component, not too complicated there, but we are receiving that promise from above. Again, it's still requested in parallel, but now we're able to incrementally show the results back here in our user page because we can show the username right away and we can use suspense while we're waiting on the post data. And this is also shown in the documentation. And speaking of documentation, you can see we still have an issue here. Even though we created our user post component, we need to import it above. Let's go ahead and do that. User posts, and this is going to come from our components.usersPost. And after I save, you'll see there is still an issue, and we're going to need to go back to the docs to reference this current issue. Again, we're using beta docs here for Next 13.2 as of the making of this video. If you're watching this months later, this issue should already be resolved, but right now it's noted in the docs and I want to highlight it. If I mouse over, we've got a TypeScript problem here. It says user posts cannot be used as a JSX component. Well, actually, there's nothing wrong with what we're doing, but we have a typing issue. Okay, we're back in the beta docs under data fetching and then fetching, and you can see there's a warning here. It says you can use async await in layouts and pages. Now, they're specifically talking about the file names layout and page or pages.tsx that we've created before, but it says they're server components, and they are. However, we're creating a server component that's named user posts as well. Using async await inside of other components like the one we just created named user post with TypeScript can cause errors from the response type from JSX. It says we are working with the TypeScript team to resolve this upstream. And as a temporary workaround, although none of us are probably going to like it, you can use this comment line right above your component. So that's what we're going to do. Just copy this right here, and we'll put it above the component for now, and realize this probably will not be an issue a few months after this video is created. So if you're not receiving an error right now the way things are, then you don't even have to do this. But let's go back to Visual Studio Code and apply this. So back in VS Code, I'm just going to put that line right above what we had, and now of course our TypeScript error is gone. It tells it to basically ignore what it's experiencing. But we have created a valid server component, it just doesn't have the name page.tsx or layout.tsx. So now that we've created our dynamic routes with the user ID and we're receiving that as a param, that user ID comes in from the URL, and then we get that and pass it into these fetch functions that are created here in parallel, and we get that data, and then of course we use suspense to incrementally show the data we get. So we have the user information, and then instead of using that loading.tsx page that would apply to the entire page or the entire branch inside of here, we're just breaking this down to part of the page using suspense. And then we're going to show that user post data. So let's see how it all works back in the browser. Okay, we're back in the browser. I'm going to clear out the network tab. We'll go back to home here, and I'll even just hold down shift and refresh so we get everything new. And of course, we're still in dev mode, so we have a lot of information coming here with network requests I can clear out. Now I'll just mouse over the users link and we can see it already requested it. So when I click on it, there it is, and we've got all of the users. Now we should no longer see errors when I start to mouse over these user IDs. We're seeing those requests, and we're seeing the data, of course, that comes with those requests. So it's prefetching those before I've even clicked. Now let me go to one of the users, and there we have the username, and then we have all of the user posts, the title and the body of each of those posts. So everything's working as we expect it to. But back at the beginning of the tutorial, if you remember, we covered metadata, and we only covered the static metadata. I said we would cover how to generate dynamic metadata as well. And notice for our user Leanne Graham, the title of the page is still Create Next App, just like we had in the layout there at the beginning for the overall app. So let's go ahead and create individual information for each user. When we go back to our users list, remember we created some static metadata, and of course that applied the user title up above, and that works just fine. Now let's go back to the code and create some dynamic metadata. We're back in Visual Studio Code, and we're back at our user page component that is inside of the dynamic route, and we need to create some dynamic metadata. What we're going to do is create that above. I can do it after the params because we're going to need that with this function as well. We'll say export async function, and the function we're going to create is called generate metadata. And now it's going to receive the same params that our user page component receives. So I could just copy all of that and paste it right inside of our generate metadata function as well, because it also needs the user ID to get that specific metadata. And after we do this, it's going to have a promise, and this is going to be metadata that we get here. Now, we haven't imported that metadata at the top yet, so let's go ahead and do that import as well. So we'll say import type, and that is metadata, and that comes from next. Okay, now that we have that, let's continue creating the function here. So afterwards, we need curly braces. And then inside of this function, we're going to need that same user data that we got in the function below. Now remember, one of those recommendations from Next was to go ahead and request data where you need it, because it will automatically deduplicate these requests. And that applies to this generate metadata function as well. So because we have the request here and the request here does not mean that two requests will be issued. They will be deduplicated. Okay, after that, let's go ahead and get our user. And once again, that is the user type. We'll set that equal to await user data. And now that we have our user data, we can return our metadata. So we're going to return, and then I'll have a title. And inside of this, I'll say user.name. Then I'm going to have a description as well. And here I'll use a template literal. So I can say this is the page of, and once again, I'll just use the user.name here. So that creates our metadata. So we'll apply this, and then let's go back to the browser and see if it applies to each one of our dynamic pages. I'm back in the browser, and we're still running our code in dev mode. I can clear out the network requests so we can see them happen once again. I'll go to users. After that, let's go to Leanne Graham. And now if we look at the top tab here, it says Leanne Graham. And I think if we're to inspect the page, we could also see that other metadata that we added. So let's look inside the head element here as we inspect, scroll down, and we see the title is Leanne Graham, and then there is a meta description, and it says this is the page of Leanne Graham. So our dynamic metadata is being generated as we expect it to be. All right, we've come a long way, and next time we're going to dive deeper into fetching with our server components. Remember, these are all server components right now, and we're going to look at the differences you can control, including static site generation, server-side rendering, and even the powerful incremental static regeneration strategy. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.